we have to talk about Ryan Walters, the superintendent of public instruction in Oklahoma. Last time we talked about this guy, let me give you a rundown of what he's been up to, because it's been maybe a couple months since I talked about him. But his big thing is he wants to indoctrinate students in Oklahoma with right-wing propaganda. And like, there's a difference between implying that's what you want to do and actually doing it. He's very quickly shifted to the, oh no, we are doing it part of this. And to that end, what he did is back in December, he released a set of state standards for social studies classes. So US history, civics, government classes, everything from kindergarten through 12th grade. He basically said these are the new standards that all public schools will have to use as a baseline for what they teach in those classes. And the way this works is it's fine for him to say these are the new standards. Then the public can see what they are. They can weigh in on those standards. And then a few months later, there's a committee that decides if anything needs to be revised. The Board of Education has to vote on them, things like that. So Walters released the standards in December. And I've made videos about those, the standards. They were very disturbing. I mean, he bragged about how Christian they were. He bragged about the fact that the Bible was mentioned like 40 plus times in the standard, as if promoting the Bible is something history classes are supposed to do. That was disturbing. And then the state's Board of Education in February was supposed to vote on those standards. Now, Governor Kevin Stitt of Oklahoma, despite being a Republican, is not actually a friend anymore of Ryan Walters. They don't like each other. Kevin Stitt's like, I'm going to replace the Board of Education members, and he has the power to do this, with 3 people who are more closely aligned to him, thinking maybe this will fend off some of Ryan Walters' worst tendencies. But Ryan Walters goes to that first meeting with this revised Board of Education, and he's like, you guys, you need to approve all these standards right away. You don't have time. We need to get it in front of the legislature so that it's ready for schools when they open back up in August. And the Board of Education was like, well, you just sent us the final draft of the standards like yesterday, and they're really long, hundreds of pages. We haven't had time to look through everything. And Walters was like, too bad. You got to vote on this right now. And so they did, and they voted to approve the standards, despite all the criticism. What Ryan Walters did not tell them is that he had gone in and changed the standards that he proposed in December to make them even worse. And that is a scary thing. And again, I've made videos about this. You can look them up already, but I'll show you just a couple examples of what he did in a second. But the Board of Education said, yeah, we approved these standards. Only saying later, oh, he changed them? We didn't know that. The Republican-dominated legislature in Oklahoma had the chance to say, we are not accepting these standards. And basically what that would have done is Ryan Walters would have had to go back to the drawing board, and public schools would just have to use the previous set of standards, which are fine. But the Republican legislature said, yeah, let's just not do anything, which meant Ryan Walters' version is the version that is now in place. And there are 2 lawsuits that have tried to stop it because August is just around the corner. Schools are back in session. One of those lawsuits was struck down. It didn't work by a district judge, and they've appealed to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. There was another lawsuit filed by church-state separation groups. That one is directly filed with the Oklahoma Supreme Court, and basically we're all waiting for the Oklahoma Supreme Court to weigh in on this. But in the meantime, Ryan Walters' version of what ought to be taught in these classes, that's what public schools have to go with right now. So what is it that Ryan Walters wants kids to learn? Well, here's a perfect example of it. This is what he wants kids to know in high school, specifically about the 2020 elections. And there's a couple things. I'm sorry, I want to clarify. This is about like the first Trump administration. So if you're a 9th grader, you're learning US history, guess what? Kids have to learn about what happened during the first Trump administration. And a lot happened during the first Trump administration. So how do you boil it down to the big things? And I want you to look at letter C first of all. Identify the source of the COVID-19 pandemic from a Chinese lab. There is no evidence, no definitive evidence that that's what happened. So what the hell? He's already claiming this right-wing conspiracy is real and putting that right in the standards. I'll remove myself here. Look at letter D. This is the one that got the most attention. Identify discrepancies in the 2020 election results by looking at graphs and other stuff, including the sudden halting of ballot counting in select cities in key battleground states, the security risks of mail-in balloting, sudden batch dumps, an unforeseen record number of voters, and the unprecedented contradiction of bellwether county trends. All of that stuff right there, that's all right-wing conspiracy thinking. Like the 2020 election results had this huge turnout because people were really pissed off at Trump. So people came out to vote in large numbers. There were no significant discrepancies that would have changed the results. There were no sudden batch dumps. That's like a Dinesh D'Souza conspiracy theory. So this is what Ryan Walters wants kids to learn about what happened in 2020, basically churning right-wing conspiracy theories into facts that children have to learn. That's why people were so mad about this. Someone's asking what grade is this? This would be 9th grade, like US history or something like that. But this is the type of thing Ryan Walters wanted to do. By the way, the old standards that Walters had put out there, the old standards used to mention George Floyd's death, murder. It mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement. Both of those were removed from the revised standards. The other thing is that Ryan Walters also treats the Bible as like legitimate history. This is an example of what he wants second graders to learn. And you could see the part that's highlighted in red. Identify stories from Christianity that influenced the American colonists, founders, and culture, including the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. For example, the Golden Rule and the Sermon on the Mount. First of all, this idea that Christianity influenced our founders? No, it didn't. That's why the Constitution doesn't mention Christianity. It's all about freedom of religion and from religion and implies separation of church and state. Like all this stuff, that Christianity did not influence the people who said we need freedom from religion. It also, this idea that they need to learn about Jesus, specifically the Golden Rule. Guess what? That's not a Jesus original. Treating others the way you want to be treated, that was around long before the Jesus story came about. And it's funny to me that he wants the Sermon on the Mount taught, because that might actually be good. But you know who doesn't give a damn about the Sermon on the Mount? Conservative Christians. You think they care about helping the least of these and helping the poor, all that stuff? No. Ryan Walters doesn't care about that. I'm surprised they knew that's a Jesus thing at this point. So this is not the only way they were mentioning religion. Here's one more. This is for 8th graders. I'll remove myself here. Evaluate the role of Judeo-Christian ideals in supporting colonial demands for independence, as exemplified by the Bible being a frequently cited authority by America's founders. That's a lie. The founders did not cite the Bible in its original documents. That's why you don't see Bible verses in the Constitution. There's a Christian pseudo-historian named David Barton who pretends this stuff happened, and he goes around church to church, politician to politician, pretending like the 10 Commandments is US history. It's not. He's a liar, and he's been debunked to the point where a Christian publisher removed his book that they published from bookshelves because they're like, this has too many lies in it. But this is what Ryan Walters wants kids to learn. So this is what he was bragging about. This is what he wanted kids to learn. It's very, very disturbing. But again, I've made videos about all the things in the standards that were disturbing, and there's more. But here's where I want to go with this story. When he passed these changes, when he single-handedly got the Board of Education to vote through his changes, and the Republicans in the legislature didn't stop him, One of the things Democrats in Oklahoma, the three of them, pointed out is that if you make these standards the new default, it's going to be really hard to find textbooks that promote all this bullshit, because Oklahoma is not a big market. Texas, for example, has a reputation for being very influential in the textbook world, because if you make textbooks and you hire people to write them and you want to sell textbooks, you want to make sure your textbook is being used in Texas or California or a state that has a lot of students. By comparison, Oklahoma doesn't. It has like 700,000 students, which for these people, for the textbook makers, it's not a huge market. So the idea that they were going to make a textbook that caters to Ryan Walters' whims, which would mean rewriting their own textbooks to incorporate his lies, you're probably not going to find that. Because even if you're a right-wing textbook publisher, it's a lot of work to write a textbook that includes all of these lies and Christian nonsense, because you don't even know if anyone's going to buy it yet. And Oklahoma is not the place you go to test out your textbooks. So Democrats pointed out it's going to be really hard to find textbooks that work, which could mean a lot of schools won't have textbooks to use that align with these standards, right? So here's where they're at right now. There is a state textbook committee whose job is right now, all the publishers who want to get in on the ground floor, they send the committee their textbooks. And it's the committee's job to go through the various textbooks, see if they align with the state standards, see if they meet all the other requirements that you would expect for any good textbook, and then make their recommendations. And they could theoretically say, you know what? We got these submissions and we endorse 8 different textbooks for US history. And the thing about their endorsement that matters is that in Oklahoma, the legislature has $33 million available for public schools if they want to buy textbooks that are on the approved list. And that's why this is a big deal. Because if the state textbook committee says, yes, this textbook is good, and a school district wants to buy new textbooks and they use something that's off that list, it's paid for by taxpayer money. It's good for the district. So then the question is, are they approving textbooks that do what Ryan Walters wants them to do? And let's say that happens. What happens if there is a textbook that perpetuates this garbage? What if a public school district says, no, we don't want to use those books because we don't want to lie to our students. We want them to actually get a good education. They can do that. They can buy their own textbooks, but they would have to pay for it some other way. And textbooks are expensive. So that's the dilemma here. Is the state going to approve actual quality textbooks, or are they going to approve garbage that school districts, some of them, might have to be stuck with because that's all that'll be paid for? So here's what's amazing about all this. There's a website, a news outlet called Oklahoma Watch, and this is an article that just appeared this week on Oklahoma Watch. The reporter is Jennifer Palmer. She's done a wonderful job over several years, I think, of documenting Ryan Walters and everything he's doing there. But basically, Oklahoma Watch got to look at all the textbooks that were submitted to the textbook committee so they can see what these publishers are now saying and whether they're incorporating what Ryan Walters wants. And there's a couple big revelations that I read about when I read that article. One of them is that one of the biggest publishers in the country, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, they didn't even bother sending Oklahoma a textbook. I think they've basically written Oklahoma off as a lost cause. They're like, screw you. We're going to work with getting our book in the hands of students in other states. So they didn't even bother sending anything to the committee. There were 2 smaller publishers that said, we don't want to send Oklahoma anything either, because if we stick to the facts, if we stick to actual history, we know the committee is going to say no to our textbooks, and we're too small of a company. We can't afford like the headlines that say Oklahoma rejects company X's textbook. They're like, we don't want the headline. We don't want the headache. So they didn't bother submitting anything either. But among the companies that did send in books, it seems like they're doing the bare minimum to appease Ryan Walters. And that's kind of amazing. It seems like the textbook publishers sending books to be approved are not caving in to his demands. Look at this. Again, this is from Oklahoma Watch. Check this out. Regarding the 2020 election, for example, an advanced placement textbook titled By the People, A History of the United States, published by Pearson, which again, big textbook company, makes no mention of sudden batch dumps or mail-in ballot concerns. It states the Trump campaign submitted a total of 63 lawsuits claiming voter fraud, but none of them, including several that reached the Supreme Court, resulted in a finding for the campaign. Yeah, that's accurate. So it seems like, okay, we will address the controversy involving the election, but we're not fanning the flames of a conspiracy theory here. So good on them. That's fantastic. But that's not all. Look at this. Another textbook for high school students addresses claims of election fraud with this. Supporters of Trump's claim believe that mail-in balloting was not secure and allege that ballot counting was halted in key battleground states, accompanied by sudden batch dumps of unfavorable votes. With an unforeseen record number of voters in the election, determining the final vote count was challenging, but then check this out. So they incorporated everything in the standards. Investigations by numerous state and federal authorities determined there was no credible evidence to support such a claim. So they addressed it, and then they said, oh yeah, by the way, all of that is bullshit. An online version specifically for Oklahoma of the same textbook basically says the same thing. He claimed the 2020 election had been stolen through widespread fraud, even though numerous state and federal authorities determined there was no credible evidence to support such a claim. Beautiful. There's another textbook from McGraw-Hill, another big textbook publisher, and look what they say as well. At the very end, these stories were anecdotes, personal stories, and they did not prove there were widespread problems. So basically, the big companies that make textbooks that did submit options for approval, they did what they had to do in addressing what Ryan Walters wanted them to address. They mentioned like the conspiracies about the election in 2020, but they also make clear all of that is bullshit. Yeah, Trump crazy people believe that stuff. Check, check, check. But also none of it has any merit. And that's a win-win situation right there. You're doing what the state wants, but also not lying to children. So that's a big deal, and you love to see it. By the way, that last McGraw-Hill textbook, they also said COVID originated in Wuhan, China, which is true, but they didn't mention anything about a lab. They're not getting into that. There's no evidence for that. So great. Now, what about the Bible? Because Ryan Walters made a big deal of shoving the Bible into every aspect of social studies curriculum. According to this Oklahoma Watch article, only one publisher included the Bible in their books. And it was a curriculum for elementary students where there was a mention of David and Goliath. But get this, you know how they did that? This is the passage in a first grade lesson titled Big Ideas from History. Look at what they say. It reads, the Hebrews told stories. Stories. One story was about David, a boy. He had to fight Goliath, a giant man. He won. People use this story when they talk about facing a big problem. So I love this, one, because they say, yeah, the Hebrews made shit up. Here's an example of it. But also, they very clearly use the David and Goliath story. Yes, it's a Bible story, but they say, oh, by the way, there's a saying, there's a metaphor that people use. You should know where that comes from and like what they're talking about. And I'm okay with that. I think it's good to be culturally literate in that sense. But it seems like the textbook publishers are not like throwing in Bible verses like this is some teen Bible somewhere. It's fantastic. So basically, here's where we're at. The companies that publish textbooks are not playing along with Ryan Walters. At best, the only thing that might make Ryan Walters happy is that some of these companies have online versions of their textbooks, and they allow teachers, they give teachers the option of editing the material in case they want to incorporate some of their own materials into the textbook. So it's not like a PDF kids are just reading through. There's some room for teachers to, hey, you should check this out, watch this video, things like that. So maybe if they want to include the bullshit, they could do it, but the textbook publishers aren't doing it for them. So it is possible now that the state textbook committee, which I will show you right here, it's like on the state's website. This is the textbook committee. Like Ryan Walters is one of the chair people. Right under him, Kendra Wesson is one of his allies. But then there's like these 12 other people who are not necessarily loyal to Ryan Walters. So even his ally is just one vote out of like 13. They have to decide which of these textbooks they're going to approve. And the rules that they adhere to is that the textbooks do not have to perfectly align with Oklahoma social studies standards in order to be approved. The standards are a suggestion. But if the textbook companies are like, screw you, those books can still be approved. And if by chance some right-wing group like PragerU submits material that perfectly aligns with Ryan Walters' wishes, the districts are not obligated to use it, even if the committee greenlights it. So that'll be interesting to see what they do now, because Ryan Walters has tried so hard to get people to believe these right-wing conspiracies, and educators are pissed, and educated parents are pissed, and so are educated students. But we didn't know what the textbook companies were going to do because they're in it for the money. And it seems like even they're not playing along. I find this interesting. There was an article published just about 6 weeks ago. And look at what Kendra Wesson said at the time. Wesson said the state textbook committee won't have any issues finding textbooks that align with the new social studies standards, even with the new content that has made headlines. We're not going to have a problem there at all, she said. Well, yeah, they're not having a problem because none of the textbook companies are playing ball with them. So Wesson can approve them or not approve them. It doesn't matter. We'll see. I love that the publishers are doing this. But again, keep in mind, this isn't just, there is a potential problem here, which is if the committee doesn't approve these textbooks, schools are going to have to find a way to deal with not having, they can't purchase the books if nothing has been approved. And if the only thing that has been approved is like PragerU, the school districts are going to have to decide, do we want the free textbooks that have lies, or do we have to fundraise to get textbooks and teach things another way? Or maybe we won't use a textbook at all, but that does make life harder for the educators in this situation. What I hope happens is that the Oklahoma Supreme Court steps in really soon and says, Ryan Walters' standards are illegal, unconstitutional. And if they do that, they could say, just use the old standards until Ryan Walters comes up with something better. And that would be the best case scenario here. I don't know how long it's going to take for the Supreme Court to weigh in, but all of this is happening because Ryan Walters does not care about education. His job is caring about education, just like Linda McMahon, but you have these people nominated, confirmed by Republicans who absolutely hate public education, and they will do anything in their power to destroy it. And Ryan Walters has gotten as far as anyone has in his state. He treats himself like a king there, but it's good to see people are not playing along. Someone mentioned this. Thank you for pointing this out. Oklahoma is ranked 49 out of 50 when it comes to education. And I've said before, I think Ryan Walters has a goal of making them number one if you rank them backwards.